In the remote highlands of 1880s Montana, a young woman's defiance sparked a reckoning that would shake an entire valley. Maren Clay refused her uncle's demand to marry for political gain, choosing chains over compromise. Hidden away in a cellar, her spirit remained unbroken even as iron shackles bound her wrists. Word of her disappearance reached Jack Rowan, a former outlaw turned rancher who remembered the girl who once shared his childhood grief across the prairie. With nothing but a broken revolver and fierce resolve, Jack rode toward danger, not as a hero seeking glory, but as a man haunted by his past and stirred by injustice. This isn't just a rescue story. It's about how one woman's courage and one man's redemption ignited a quiet rebellion against unchecked power. When the most ruthless uncle in the territory thought he could break his niece's will, he never imagined she would find an ally willing to risk everything. But what price would Jack pay to set her free? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana highlands in 1892 stretched endlessly beneath a sky that seemed to hold all the world's promises and sorrows in equal measure. Here, where the earth met heaven in jagged peaks and rolling meadows, the Clay family had once carved out a life from wilderness and hope. Their ranch house, built by Maren's father Thomas with his own weathered hands, had stood as a testament to honest labor and simple dreams. Maren Clay remembered those days with the clarity that only loss can bring. She could still hear her mother's laughter echoing through rooms now empty, still smell the bread baking in the kitchen where shadows fell differently now. At 24, she possessed the kind of beauty that came not from perfect features, but from a spirit that refused to be dimmed by hardship. Her auburn hair caught light like fire, and her green eyes held depths that spoke of both gentleness and steel. The locket at her throat contained the only portrait she had left of her parents, tintypes that captured their faces in moments of quiet joy. Thomas Clay with his carpenter's hands and honest smile, Eleanor with her gentle wisdom and infinite patience. They had died within a month of each other during the harsh winter of 1890, leaving their daughter to face a world that suddenly seemed intent on claiming everything she held dear. Uncle Silas Clay had arrived for the funeral and never left. Tall and angular, with silver hair that he wore like a crown, and eyes that calculated profit in every glance, he was Thomas's older brother by 15 years, and his opposite in every way that mattered. Where Thomas had built with love, Silas acquired through cunning. Where Thomas had earned respect through character, Silas commanded fear through power. A young woman alone cannot manage such responsibilities, he had declared with the authority of someone accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. Family looks after family, Maren. I'll see that everything is properly managed. His version of proper management involved documents that Maren was too grief-stricken to read carefully. Legal papers that somehow transferred her father's carefully built legacy into her uncle's capable hands. By the time she understood what had happened, Silas Clay owned not just the ranch, but the very ground beneath her feet. The marriage proposal came disguised as an opportunity. Harrison Blackwood, the railroad magnate's son, needed a wife who could provide local connections and social respectability. Maren would provide both, along with the final piece of property that would complete Silas's vision of a cattle empire stretching from the valley floor to the mountain peaks. "You'll want for nothing," Silas had assured her, his voice carrying the tone of a man explaining simple mathematics to a child. "The Blackwood name carries weight throughout the territory. Your children will inherit privilege most folks can only dream of." But Maren had dreams of her own, dreams that didn't include Harrison Blackwood's pale hands or calculating eyes. She had met him twice, once at a church social where he spoke only of profit margins, once at a community gathering where he treated her like property being evaluated for purchase. Both times she had felt something inside her shrivel at his touch. Her refusal had been quiet but absolute. "I won't marry him, Uncle. I won't marry anyone I don't choose to love." Silas's response had been swift and merciless. "Love," he had said, as if the word tasted bitter in his mouth, "is a luxury for those who can afford it. You, my dear niece, cannot." The cellar beneath the ranch house had been built by her father as root storage, a place to keep vegetables fresh through the long Montana winters. Now it served as her prison, its stone walls holding not sustenance, but despair. Iron shackles, forged in the local blacksmith shop that had once repaired her father's tools, now held her wrists in their cold embrace. Yet even in darkness, Marin's spirit remained unbroken. She remembered her father's words. A person's worth isn't measured by what others do to them, but by how they choose to respond. She chose defiance over surrender, hope over despair, even when hope seemed as distant as the stars she could no longer see. 20 miles away, Jack Rowan stood on the porch of his own small ranch, watching the same stars and feeling the weight of his own choices. At 32, he carried the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving mistakes and choosing to learn from them. His dark hair showed premature silver at the temples, and his hands bore the calluses of honest work, overlaying older scars from less honest times. The broken revolver in his gun belt served as both reminder and penance, damaged beyond repair. During his last job as an outlaw, kept now as a symbol of the violence he had chosen to leave behind. He had spent 5 years building a life based on different principles, 5 years proving to himself and his community that a man could change if he truly wanted to. But some bonds, once forged, are never truly broken, and some promises, once made in childhood innocence, echo through the years until they demand to be kept. The morning after Marin's first night in the cellar, Uncle Silas descended the wooden steps with the measured pace of a man conducting business. He carried with him a leather portfolio, its contents as carefully organized as his ambitions. The land deed inside bore official seals and signatures, but closer inspection would have revealed the subtle alterations that transformed theft into legal acquisition. "I trust you've had time to reconsider," he said, settling into the single chair he had placed in the cellar for these daily visits. The light from his oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, making the space feel even smaller than its confining dimensions suggested. Marin lifted her chin with the same defiance that had sustained her through the night. Her wrists bore the first marks of the iron shackles, but her voice remained steady. "I have considered many things, Uncle, mostly how disappointed my father would be to see what you've become." Silas's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the portfolio. "Your father was a dreamer, Marin. Dreams don't build empires or secure futures. I'm offering you security beyond anything Thomas could have provided. You're offering me bondage dressed up as privilege. I'm offering you reality." He opened the portfolio, displaying the forged deed with the pride of an artist showing his masterwork. "This document makes me the legal owner of every acre your father worked, every fence post he set, every field he cleared, every dream he poured into this land. It all belongs to me now." The sight of her father's signature, carefully copied by an expert forger, hit Marin like a physical blow. But she had learned early that showing pain only encouraged those who sought to inflict it. Legal and right aren't always the same thing. "Perhaps not," Silas conceded with a thin smile. "But legal is what matters in courtrooms and business. Dealings. Harrison Blackwood's investment in our family's future depends on this union proceeding as planned. The railroad needs reliable local partnerships, and I need the capital to expand operations. Your marriage serves everyone's interests. Everyone, except mine." "Your interests," he said, closing the portfolio with deliberate finality, "are whatever I determine them to be. You're a woman without property, without means, without legal standing. I am your guardian and your provider. The choice is simple. Marry Harrison Blackwood with grace and dignity, or remain here until you develop more reasonable expectations about your circumstances. After he left, Maren examined the shackles that bound her wrists. The iron was cold and unyielding, crafted by Samuel Morrison, the same blacksmith who had repaired her father's tools and shod their horses. She wondered if Sam knew what his work was being used for, or if gold had a way of blinding even honest men to uncomfortable truths. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in the town of Cedar Falls, Jack Rowan sat at his usual table in Murphy's saloon, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The establishment served more as a community gathering place than a den of iniquity. Murphy ran a respectable business that accommodated both the social drinking and the serious conversations that shaped local politics. "Haven't seen Maren Clay in town for near a month," observed Doc Henderson, settling his considerable bulk into the chair across from Jack. The town's physician possessed the kind of forthright manner that came from dealing with life and death. On their own terms, "Silas claims she's taken ill, but he won't let me examine her." Jack's fingers found the grip of his broken revolver, a habit that surfaced whenever his instincts detected trouble. "What kind of illness keeps a healthy young woman confined for weeks?" "The kind that doesn't want medical attention," Doc replied, grimly. "I've seen enough family disputes to recognize the signs. Silas Clay has plans for that girl, and they don't include her having opinions about them." Old Pete Morrison, the blacksmith's father, leaned in from the neighboring table. His weathered face carried the deep lines of a man who had witnessed 8 decades of human nature in all its variations. "My boy Sam made some special hardware for Silas last week. Wouldn't say what it was for, but it wasn't horseshoes or fence repairs. Had the look of restraints about it." The words hit Jack like cold water. His hand unconsciously moved to the carved wooden horse in his vest pocket, a childhood token he had crafted for Maren during one of their innocent adventures. The memory of her delighted laughter when he presented it seemed to mock the current reality. "Someone should check on her," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of growing certainty about what they would find. Doc Henderson nodded slowly. "Someone should. Question is, who's got the spine to stand up to Silas Clay when the sheriff's been known to look the other way, where Clay business is concerned?" The question hung in the air like smoke from Murphy's fireplace, unanswered but understood by every man present. That evening Jack sat alone on his porch, turning the carved wooden horse over in his weathered hands. The toy was no bigger than his palm, whittled from a piece of pine during a summer when he was 14, and the world still held the promise that good intentions might be enough to shape a decent life. He had made it for Maren during the summer of 1878, when both their families still believed in futures that stretched bright and unbroken toward distant horizons. The Rowans and the Clays had been neighbors then, separated by 5 miles of prairie, but united by the kind of mutual respect that frontier life demanded. Jack's father, Samuel Rowan, was a man who measured wealth in terms of honest work and kept promises, while Thomas Clay built his dreams one fence post at a time. That summer, both families had suffered losses that bound them together in grief. Jack's mother had died in childbirth, taking with her the baby brother he had already begun to love. Maren's infant sister had succumbed to fever just weeks later, leaving her parents hollow-eyed with sorrow and her own young heart struggling to understand why sometimes prayers went unanswered. The 2 children had found each other in that shared sadness, creating an alliance born of understanding rather than mere proximity. They would meet at the old oak tree that marked the boundary between their properties, sharing silence when words felt inadequate and stories when imagination offered better comfort than reality. Jack remembered the day he had presented the wooden horse to Maren. She'd been sitting beneath the oak, her auburn hair catching afternoon sunlight like captured fire, her green eyes still reflecting the weight of recent loss. "For you," he had said with the awkward formality of a boy unused to grand gestures. She had taken the carving with the careful reverence children reserve for treasures that might break if handled too roughly. "It's beautiful, Jack. What's his name?" "Haven't thought of one." Maybe you should choose. Freedom, she had said without hesitation, running her small fingers along the horse's carved mane, because he looks like he could run anywhere he wanted to. The memory carried both sweetness and sorrow. Within 2 years, Jack's father had lost the ranch to debt and drink, forcing them to move to town, where Samuel Rowan's broken spirit finally surrendered entirely. Jack, left to raise himself at 16, had chosen paths that led away from that oak tree and everything it represented. The outlaw years had been born of necessity that gradually transformed into something darker. When a young man has nothing left to lose, the distinction between taking what you need and taking what you want becomes dangerously blurred. Jack had ridden with 3 different gangs, each more ruthless than the last, until the day his broken revolver had jammed during what should have been a simple bank robbery in Denver. The malfunction had saved his life in ways he hadn't understood. At the time, instead of firing the shot that would have killed an innocent teller, a young father with frightened eyes and trembling hands, Jack had found himself staring into a mirror of his own lost childhood. The teller's terror reflected Jack's own memories of helplessness, and in that moment something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of who he wanted to be. He had walked away from that bank without taking $1, left his gang without explanation, and spent the next 5 years building a different kind of life. The broken revolver stayed with him as reminder and penance, a daily confrontation with the man he had been and the choice to become someone better. Now, as he sat beneath stars that had witnessed both his failures and his efforts at redemption, Jack found himself thinking about promises made beneath an oak tree and the girl who had named a wooden horse Freedom. Marin had grown into a woman who embodied that same spirit of independence, and the thought of her chained in darkness stirred something in him that had nothing to do with romantic sentiment and everything to do with fundamental justice. The next morning brought news that confirmed his growing fears. Sarah Whitman, who served as housekeeper at the Clay Ranch, appeared at his door with the kind of nervous energy that spoke of dangerous secrets and difficult choices. "Mr. Rowan," she said, glancing around as if Uncle Silas might materialize. "From thin air, I need to speak with you about Miss Marin." Jack invited her inside, offering coffee she was too agitated to accept. Sarah was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with the practical bearing of someone who had learned to navigate difficult situations through careful observation and selective silence. "She's not sick," Sarah said without preamble. "Mr. Silas has her locked in the cellar, chained like some kind of animal. Says she'll stay there until she agrees to marry that railroad man's son." The wooden horse seemed to grow heavier in Jack's pocket. Somewhere in the distance, he could almost hear the echo of a child's voice saying the word freedom, with the certainty that it meant something sacred and inviolable. "How long has she been down there?" "Going on 2 weeks now. She's strong, Mr. Rowan, but everyone has limits." The cellar beneath the Clay Ranch house measured 12 feet by 8 feet, its stone walls bearing the marks of her father's careful construction. Thomas Clay had built this space to preserve the bounty of summer harvests through harsh Montana winters, never imagining it would become his daughter's prison. The irony was not lost on Marin. A place designed to sustain life now served to break her spirit. The iron shackles around her wrists had been forged with meticulous attention to both security and suffering. Each link in the chain bore the distinctive mark of Samuel Morrison's hammer, crafted with the same skill he brought to horseshoes and plowshares. The metal had worn smooth in places where Marin's movements had polished it, but its grip remained as unyielding as Uncle Silas's ambitions. 2 weeks of captivity had taught her to measure time by the rhythm of footsteps overhead. Sarah's quick, nervous steps as she went about her household duties. Uncle Silas's measured stride as he conducted his daily business. The heavier footfalls of Harrison Blackwood during his increasingly frequent visits, each one bringing her closer to a deadline she refused to acknowledge. Marin had developed strategies for survival that went beyond mere physical endurance. In the darkness, she reconstructed her father's workshop in perfect detail, remembering every tool, every project he had undertaken with patient hands and generous heart. She could smell the wood shavings, hear the steady rhythm of his plane, smoothing rough lumber into something useful and beautiful. When memories of warmth and safety threatened to overwhelm her with grief, she turned to mathematics, calculating distances between towns, figuring compound interest on imaginary investments, solving engineering problems her father had taught her during long winter evenings. The mental exercises kept her mind sharp and her spirit focused on possibilities beyond these stone walls. Physical movement, restricted by the shackles, became a form of meditation. She could pace exactly 4 steps in each direction before the chains stopped her progress. 8 steps total. 480 steps made a mile if she could walk in a straight line. By her count, she'd walked nearly 60 miles in this 8x12 space, traveling nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The worst moments came when Uncle Silas brought visitors to observe his prize. Harrison Blackwood had descended those wooden steps 3 times, each visit more presumptuous than the last. On his most recent appearance, he had carried himself with the confident air of a man examining livestock he had already purchased. "She's spirited," he had observed to Silas, as if Maren were incapable of hearing or understanding. "I appreciate. A woman with backbone, provided she learns when to bend it." "She'll learn," Silas had assured him. "Isolation has a way of clarifying priorities. A few more days, and she'll be grateful for any reasonable offer of companionship." But Maren's spirit had not broken. It had crystallized. Each day of imprisonment had stripped away everything except the essential core of who she was, and what remained was harder than the iron that bound her wrists. She thought of her mother's quiet strength during her father's difficult seasons, of the way Eleanor Clay had maintained grace and dignity even when faced with losses that would have crushed lesser souls. In the pre-dawn hours, when the house above fell silent and even Sarah's restless movements ceased, Maren allowed herself to remember Jack Rowan. Not the man he had become, she knew only fragments of his reputation, but the boy who had understood loss and offered comfort in the form of a wooden horse named Freedom. She wondered if he even remembered those summer afternoons beneath the oak tree, if the carved toy still existed somewhere, if the man who had chosen darker paths ever thought about the choices that might have led elsewhere. The wondering was not romantic fantasy, but practical assessment. Jack Rowan was the only person she knew who had reason to remember her as something other than Uncle Silas's troublesome niece. The shackles clinked softly as she shifted position, their sound a constant reminder of her physical limitations. But physical limitations were only one kind of bondage, and Maren had learned to distinguish between the chains that held her body and the freedom that remained inviolate in her mind and spirit. Above her, the floorboards creaked as someone moved. Through the kitchen, Sarah beginning another day of pretending not to see what everyone knew was happening beneath their feet. The sound brought both comfort and frustration. Comfort in knowing she was not entirely forgotten, frustration in understanding how completely Uncle Silas had isolated her from help, yet isolation worked both ways. If it prevented her from reaching potential allies, it also limited Uncle Silas's ability to monitor every thought, every plan, every hope she nurtured in the darkness. The iron shackles could restrain her movements, but they could not chain her mind or her determination to reclaim the freedom that was her birthright. In the growing light that filtered through the single small window, Maren began to plan. Sarah Whitman had served the Clay family for 8 years, long enough to witness both its rise under Thomas's patient leadership and its corruption under Silas's ruthless ambition. She possessed the particular kind of invisibility that domestic servants learn to cultivate, present when needed, absent when inconvenient, and always careful to see nothing that might complicate her employment. But some things could not be. Unseen, and some silences became complicity. The letter she carried in her apron pocket had been written in fragments over 3 sleepless nights, each word chosen with the care of someone who understood that discovery would mean more than dismissal. Sarah had watched Uncle Silas transform from occasional visitor to tyrannical master, had seen Maren's bright spirit gradually confined until it existed only in a cellar beneath their feet. The decision to contact Jack Rowan had not come easily. Sarah remembered him as a wild boy who had grown into a dangerous man, someone whose reputation included violence and lawlessness. But she also remembered the way he had looked at Maren during their childhood friendship, with the kind of protective devotion that suggested depths beneath his troubled surface. More importantly, Jack Rowan was the only person in the territory who had both the capability and the motivation to challenge Uncle Silas directly. The morning was crisp with the promise of autumn as Sarah made her way to town, her basket filled with legitimate errands that would provide cover for her true mission. Uncle Silas had ridden to the county seat on railroad business, leaving her with rare freedom to move about without constant surveillance. Murphy's saloon occupied the corner of Main and Cedar Streets, its weathered exterior belying the important role it played as the unofficial headquarters for local politics and gossip. Sarah had never entered the establishment, respectable women simply didn't, but she knew Jack Rowan could be found there most mornings, conducting whatever business occupied reformed outlaws turned ranchers. She waited across the street, pretending to examine vegetables at Henderson's produce stand while watching for Jack's familiar figure. When he emerged from the saloon, walking with the measured gait of a man who had learned to move through the world without drawing unnecessary attention, Sarah felt her heart quicken with nervous energy. "Mr. Rowan," she called softly, approaching. With the careful deference that her position demanded, Jack stopped, his expression curious but cautious. Sarah Whitman was known throughout Cedar Falls as a woman of impeccable character and practical wisdom, not someone who engaged in casual conversation with men of questionable reputation. "Mrs. Whitman," he acknowledged with a respectful nod. "How can I help you?" Sarah glanced around nervously before withdrawing the letter from her apron. The paper was carefully folded, sealed with candle wax, and addressed in her precise script. "I need you to read this, Mr. Rowan, but not here, not where others might see." Jack accepted the letter with the gravity her manner demanded. "Should I be concerned about what it contains?" "You should be concerned about what happens if you ignore it," Sarah replied quietly. "Miss Maren is in terrible danger, and I fear there's no one else who might be willing to help her." The letter's contents were devastating in their simplicity. "Mr. Rowan, I pray this reaches you and finds you still possessed of the honor I remember from your youth. Miss Maren Clay has been imprisoned in the cellar of her family's ranch for nearly 3 weeks. Her uncle has chained her there, demanding she consent to marriage with Harrison Blackwood. She refuses, and he grows more desperate daily. I have served this family faithfully, but I cannot stand by while an innocent woman suffers such treatment. Mr. Silas has corrupted the local sheriff with gold and threats. The community turns away, either from fear or indifference. You knew Miss Maren as a child. Perhaps you remember the girl who valued freedom above all else. That girl has grown into a woman of remarkable courage, but courage alone cannot break her in chains or stone walls. I can provide details of the house's layout and Mr. Silas's routines. The cellar can be accessed through a door behind the kitchen, but he keeps it locked and carries the key personally. Miss Maren's condition weakens daily, though her spirit remains unbroken. If you retain any feeling for justice or memory of childhood friendship, I beg you to consider action. Time grows short, and I fear what desperation might drive her uncle to attempt, a friend to truth and mercy. S. Whitman. Jack read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each word. The image of Maren chained in darkness struck him like a physical blow. Awakening protective instincts he thought he had buried with his outlaw past. "How certain are you of these details?" he asked Sarah quietly. As certain as someone can be who has served meals to the man responsible and heard Miss Maren's voice through the cellar door. Sarah's composure cracked slightly, revealing the strain of weeks spent maintaining silence. She speaks to herself sometimes, working through mathematical problems or reciting poetry. It's heartbreaking, Mr. Rowan. She's fighting to keep her mind sharp and her spirit strong, but no one can endure such treatment indefinitely. Jack folded the letter carefully, his mind already working through possibilities and obstacles. What does Silas plan if she continues to refuse? I don't know, but Harrison Blackwood grows impatient. Yesterday, I heard him tell Mr. Silas that alternative arrangements might be necessary if Miss Maren cannot be convinced to see reason. The euphemism carried implications that made Jack's blood run cold. How often is Silas away from the ranch? Railroad business takes him to town twice. Weekly, sometimes to the county seat. But he's hired additional hands recently, rough men who ask no questions and follow orders without conscience. Jack nodded slowly, understanding that any rescue attempt would require careful planning and considerable risk. But the memory of a wooden horse named Freedom and the girl who had believed that name held sacred meaning, made the choice inevitable. Mrs. Whitman, he said quietly, you've done a brave thing bringing this to me. Now I need you to do one more brave thing. Go back to that house and act as if nothing has changed. Can you do that? Sarah straightened her shoulders with visible resolve. For Miss Maren, I can do whatever is necessary. Jack spent the remainder of that day in careful reconnaissance, riding the perimeter of the Clay Ranch under the pretense of checking his own boundary markers. The property he once knew as a place of warmth and honest labor had transformed into something resembling a fortress. Uncle Silas had indeed hired additional men, hard-faced individuals who carried themselves with the particular alertness of those accustomed to violence. From a concealed position in the pine grove that bordered the eastern pasture, Jack studied the ranch house through his father's old field glasses. The building itself remained unchanged, the same log construction his own hands had helped raise during a barn raising 20 years past. But the atmosphere had shifted fundamentally. Where Thomas Clay's ranch had welcomed neighbors and travelers, Silas's domain projected suspicion and controlled access. The military map Jack spread across his kitchen table that evening bore the careful annotations of a man who understood terrain and tactical advantage. Years of evading federal marshals had taught him to read landscape as a chess player reads the board, every hill and gully representing potential cover, every approach offering specific advantages and vulnerabilities. The Clay Ranch sat in a natural depression surrounded by rolling hills on three sides, with the fourth side opening toward the main road. The house faced east, its front porch commanding a clear view of approaching visitors. A barn and several outbuildings provided storage and shelter, but they also created blind spots that could be exploited by someone moving with stealth and purpose. The cellar entrance, according to Sarah's intelligence, lay behind the kitchen on the north side of the house. A small window provided the space's only natural light, positioned at ground level and partially concealed by wild rose bushes that Eleanor Clay had planted years before. The irony was bitter. Flowers meant to beautify now served to hide her daughter's imprisonment. Jack's preparations extended beyond mere geography. In a wooden crate beneath his floorboards, wrapped in oiled canvas, lay the tools of his former trade. Not weapons of violence, but instruments of infiltration. Lockpicks crafted from piano wire, a glass cutter borrowed permanently from a jewelry store in Denver, rope that could support a man's weight while making no sound against wood or stone. The broken revolver remained in his gun belt, its damaged firing pin a constant reminder of choices that had led him away from bloodshed. But Jack had learned during his outlaw years that the most effective weapons were often the ones never fired. Fear and uncertainty could accomplish more than bullets, particularly when employed by someone who understood the psychology of violence without embracing its necessity. Yet as he cleaned and checked each piece of equipment, Jack faced an internal conflict that had nothing to do with tactics or timing. The man he had become over the past 5 years valued peace, sought resolution through reason, and believed that most problems could be solved without resorting to the methods that had defined his younger self. But Marin's situation demanded action that his peaceful principles could not provide. Uncle Silas responded only to force or the credible threat of force. The corrupt local authorities would protect his interests regardless of law or justice. Conventional approaches would accomplish nothing except warning Silas to increase security, or worse, to accelerate whatever timeline he had established for resolving his Marin problem. The wooden horse sat on Jack's table beside the map, its carved features catching lamplight like a talisman from a more innocent time. He picked it up, feeling the smoothness that 17 years of handling had given the pine surface. Marin had carried this token of their childhood friendship until the day her parents died. Sarah had mentioned seeing it among her personal effects before Uncle Silas had confined her to the cellar. Freedom, Jack said aloud, remembering the name she had given the wooden horse. The word carried different weight now, freighted with understanding about the cost of liberty and the price of defending it. His planning sessions extended deep into the night, each scenario carefully considered and evaluated. A direct assault would likely succeed in the short term, but would brand him a criminal and endanger both his own future and Marin's safety. Stealth offered better prospects, but required precise timing and considerable luck. The solution, when it came to him, balanced audacity with practicality. Instead of trying to avoid Silas's hired security, Jack would use their presence against. In them, men accustomed to violence often assumed that all threats would manifest through violence, creating blind spots for approaches they didn't expect. But first, he needed to test his theory about the current state of local law enforcement and Uncle Silas's relationship with Sheriff Crawford. That investigation would require a different kind of reconnaissance, one conducted in plain sight, using the tools of conversation rather than stealth. The next morning, Jack rode into Cedar Falls with the measured pace of a man conducting ordinary business, his broken revolver secure in its holster and his mind focused on the careful performance he was about to undertake. The investigation into Sheriff Crawford's loyalties required no elaborate deception. Jack simply walked into the sheriff's office at mid-morning when the lazy autumn sunlight revealed dust motes dancing in air thick with tobacco smoke and unfulfilled promises of justice. Crawford looked up from his desk with the expression of a man perpetually annoyed by interruptions to his comfortable routine. At 55, he had grown soft around the middle and harder around the edges, his badge serving more as decoration than symbol of duty. Jack Rowan, Crawford said without enthusiasm. What brings you to town? Neighborly concern, Jack replied, settling into the chair across from the sheriff's desk without invitation. Haven't seen Marin Clay around lately. Folks are starting to worry. Crawford's reaction confirmed Jack's suspicions. The sheriff's eyes shifted away from direct contact, and his fingers drummed against the desk with the nervous energy of a man concealing uncomfortable truths. Miss Clay is indisposed, Crawford said carefully. Family matter. Her uncle's handling it appropriately. What kind of family matter keeps a healthy young woman away from church and community for 3 weeks? The kind that's none of your business, Rowan. Crawford's voice carried a warning that might have been more effective, coming from someone who hadn't spent the past hour drinking whiskey disguised as coffee. Silas Clay is a respected member of this community. If he says his niece is ill, then she's ill. Jack leaned back in his chair, studying Crawford with the patient attention of a predator evaluating prey. Respected is an interesting word choice, Sheriff. I might have chosen wealthy or connected. Respect generally requires character. Crawford's face flushed with anger and something that might have been shame. Your reputation doesn't give you the right to cast aspersions on your betters, Rowan. I'd advise you to mind your own affairs and let decent folks handle theirs. Decent folks, Jack repeated thoughtfully. Is that what we're calling them now? The conversation established everything Jack needed to know about local law enforcement. Crawford wasn't just compromised, he was actively complicit in whatever Uncle Silas was doing to maintain control over Maren. Any attempt to work within legal channels would accomplish nothing except alerting Silas to Jack's interest in the situation. That evening, as darkness settled over the Montana landscape like a familiar blanket, Jack began his approach to the Clay Ranch. He moved with the patient stealth that had kept him alive during his outlaw years, using natural cover and terrain features to remain invisible to watchers who might be scanning for conventional threats. The pine grove on the eastern boundary provided perfect concealment for observation. From his position among the trees, Jack could see the ranch house clearly while remaining completely hidden from view. Lamplight glowed in several windows, and he could make out the silhouettes of Silas's hired men as they conducted their evening patrol. The security routine was professional but predictable. 2 men walked the perimeter at regular intervals, their pattern suggesting military training, but also revealing the kind of overconfidence that comes from assuming no serious threat exists. They carried rifles and moved with the casual alertness of soldiers on routine duty, rather than the heightened awareness of men expecting actual combat. Jack's attention focused on the small cellar window, partially concealed by Eleanor Clay's rose bushes. No light emanated from the opening, but that didn't necessarily mean the space was empty. Maren might be conserving what little illumination she had, or she might be sleeping through another night of captivity. As he watched, Sarah Whitman emerged from the kitchen door, carrying a tray. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone performing a task that required discretion, glancing around to ensure she wasn't observed before disappearing around the corner of the house toward the cellar entrance. The sight confirmed that Maren was still alive and still imprisoned. Sarah's furtive behavior suggested she was bringing food and possibly other necessities, maintaining her mistress's physical condition while Uncle Silas worked to break her psychological resistance. Jack waited until Sarah had completed her errand and returned to the house before moving closer. The distance from the pine grove to the ranch house was perhaps 200 yards of open ground, but the rolling terrain provided sufficient cover for someone who understood how to use darkness and shadow as allies. Hidden among the rose bushes, Jack could hear voices through the cellar window, not words, but the cadence of conversation. Maren was speaking, her voice carrying the measured rhythm of someone reciting poetry or working through mathematical problems. The sound struck him like a physical blow, confirming both her continued imprisonment and her remarkable determination to maintain mental clarity despite her circumstances. In his vest pocket, pages torn from an old journal contained what might be his most important intelligence yet. During his afternoon in town, Jack had quietly gathered information about Uncle Silas's business dealings, Harrison Blackwood's railroad connections, and the timeline for their planned union of corporate and political interests. Maren's marriage to Blackwood was scheduled for the end of the month, less than 2 weeks away. If she continued to refuse consent, alternative arrangements would indeed become necessary. Jack's sources suggested those alternatives might involve declaring her mentally incompetent, allowing Uncle Silas to make legal decisions on her behalf. The discovery added urgency to his planning. Whatever action he intended to take needed to happen soon, before Uncle Silas moved to a more permanent solution to his niece's inconvenient independence. As Jack retreated to his position in the pine grove, he carried with him not just tactical intelligence, but emotional confirmation of what he had already suspected. Maren Clay was still the remarkable woman who had grown from the courageous girl he remembered. Her spirit remained unbroken, her mind remained sharp, and her determination to preserve her freedom remained absolute. Now he needed to prove himself worthy of that faith she had placed in a wooden horse named Freedom so many years ago. 3 nights of careful observation had revealed the routine that would provide Jack his opportunity. Uncle Silas conducted business in town every Tuesday evening, meeting with railroad representatives and local politicians in the back room of the Cattleman's Hotel. His hired security maintained their patrol schedule, but with reduced vigilance. When their employer was absent, more importantly, Sarah Whitman delivered Marin's evening meal precisely at 9 o'clock, using those few minutes to provide not just sustenance, but also the human contact that was keeping her mistress anchored to hope. Jack waited until the security patrol had passed the north side of the house before moving from his concealment among the rose bushes. The cellar window was small, barely large enough for a man's shoulders, but it would accommodate conversation if conducted in whispers. He tapped gently on the glass. 3 soft sounds that could have been wind-blown debris, when no response came. He repeated the pattern, adding a 4th tap that created a distinctive rhythm unlikely to be confused with natural noise. "Who's there?" Marin's voice came through the window, cautious but curious rather than frightened. "An old friend," Jack replied quietly, his mouth close to the glass. "Someone who remembers a wooden horse named Freedom." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Jack began to worry his words hadn't carried clearly through the barrier between them. Then Marin spoke again, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. "Jack? Jack Rowan?" "The same, though considerably older and hopefully wiser than the boy you once knew." "I thought—" Marin's voice broke slightly before strengthening with visible effort. "I thought no one knew where I was. No one cared what had happened to me. Sarah Whitman cares enough to risk her position bringing me information, and I care enough to risk considerably more to get you out of there." Through the window, Jack could see the faint outline of Marin's face in the darkness. She had moved as close to the glass as her restraints would allow, and he could make out the glint of tears on her cheeks. "The shackles," she said simply. "My uncle keeps the key on his person at all times. Even if you could get me out of this cellar, I cannot walk far or move quickly." Jack reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something that caught the dim light filtering through the window. A thin piece of metal, shaped with the precise curves and angles that spoke of specialized purpose. "Lock picks," he explained. "Skills I learned during my less respectable years, put to better use now. Iron restraints are only as strong as the mechanisms that secure them." The sight of potential liberation brought both hope and practical concern to Marin's voice. "My uncle has armed men watching the property. They patrol regularly, and they're not the sort to ask questions before shooting. I've been watching them for 3 days. They're professional but predictable. More importantly, they're looking for external threats, not rescue operations conducted by someone who knows the property and understands their patterns." Jack withdrew another item from his pocket, a small silver ring that gleamed with promises. In the moonlight, it was his mother's wedding band, the only valuable possession his father hadn't lost to debt and despair. "This is a promise," he said, holding the ring where Marin could see it clearly. "Not of marriage or romantic attachment, but of commitment. I will get you out of there, Marin. I will restore your freedom and ensure that your uncle faces consequences for what he's done to you." Marin's fingers touched the glass from her side, aligning with where Jack held the ring on his. The gesture carried the weight of trust freely given and responsibility willingly accepted. "When?" she asked simply. "Tomorrow night. Your uncle has a meeting with the railroad consortium that will keep him in town until late. The security patrol follows a pattern that creates a 15-minute window when the north side of the house is unwatched. Sarah will ensure the cellar door is unlocked, and after you free me, my uncle will not simply accept defeat. He has too much invested in this marriage arrangement to let me disappear quietly." Jack's expression hardened with determination that Marin could sense even in the darkness. "After I free you, we make sure he understands that his investment was poorly calculated. Some battles are won through violence, others through exposure of truth. Your uncle's power depends on maintaining certain appearances and relationships. Both can be disrupted by someone who knows which pressure points to apply. You sound different than I remember, Maren observed quietly. Older, certainly, but also more thoughtful, less angry. 5 years of trying to build something instead. Of tear it down will do that to a man. Though I confess your situation has awakened some of the older instincts. Good, Maren said with quiet fierceness. I need the man you've become, but I may also need some of the skills you learned becoming him. Jack smiled at the steel in her voice. Hold on to that spirit, Maren. Tomorrow night, we're going to need all of it. As he prepared to withdraw from the window, Maren called his name softly. Jack, do you still have the wooden horse? He patted his vest pocket where the carved token rested against his heart. Always. Freedom is a promise that deserves to be kept. The plan unraveled with the methodical precision of a clock spring, snapping under too much tension. Jack had positioned himself among the rose bushes at exactly 9:15, counting the minutes until the security patrol would round the eastern corner of the house and disappear from view. Sarah had confirmed that Uncle Silas was in town for his railroad meeting, and the cellar door stood unlocked as promised. Every element had aligned perfectly for Maren's liberation. What Jack hadn't accounted for was Harrison Blackwood's impatience. The railroad magnate's son had arrived unannounced at 8:30, demanding to speak with his intended bride and refusing to accept Uncle Silas's absence as reason for delay. When the hired security explained that Miss Clay was indisposed, Blackwood had dismissed their concerns with the arrogant authority of someone accustomed to having obstacles removed rather than navigating around them. I'll speak with her myself, he had declared. A man has the right to evaluate his investment before committing to purchase. Jack watched in growing alarm as Blackwood descended toward the cellar, accompanied by 2 armed men who carried themselves with the particular alertness of soldiers expecting trouble. The 15-minute window he had counted on had collapsed into immediate crisis. Inside the cellar, Maren heard the approach of multiple footsteps and steeled herself for another confrontation with her unwelcome suitor, the torn wedding dress that Uncle Silas had forced her to examine lay crumpled in the corner, a symbol of the life she refused to accept and the future she would not embrace willingly. Miss Clay, Blackwood's voice carried the practiced charm of a man accustomed to buying cooperation rather than earning it. I trust your period of reflection has brought clarity to your thinking. My thinking has never been clearer, Maren replied with quiet dignity. I will not marry you, Mr. Blackwood. Not today, not next week, not ever. Blackwood's facade of civility cracked slightly, revealing the calculating coldness beneath. Your uncle has explained the alternatives to cooperation. Surely a woman of your intelligence can recognize when circumstances have moved beyond the luxury of personal preference. My circumstances, Maren said, raising her shackled wrists, were created by men who mistake force for authority and compliance for consent. Neither mistake changes my answer. Outside, Jack realized that waiting for the patrol's return would doom any chance of rescue. Blackwood's presence had altered the timeline irrevocably. If he hoped to reach Maren before the situation deteriorated, further action was required immediately. He moved toward the cellar door with the fluid stealth that had kept him alive during years of avoiding federal marshals. The lockpicks felt familiar in his hands, their metal surfaces warmed by contact with his skin, and memories of similar desperate moments when freedom had depended on steady nerves and precise manipulation of mechanical systems. The door opened, silently on hinges that Sarah had thoughtfully oiled earlier that day. Jack descended the wooden steps with infinite care, each footfall placed with the precision of a man who understood that a single sound could mean the difference between rescue and disaster, but the cellar's confines amplified every noise, and Blackwood's guards were more alert than Jack had anticipated. The first man turned at the whisper of movement behind him, his rifle rising with practiced efficiency. Who the hell? Jack's response was immediate and violent, drawing on skills he had hoped never to use again. His hand closed over the guards, mouth while his arm encircled the man's throat, applying pressure that would render him unconscious without permanent harm. But the second guard was already raising his weapon, and Blackwood was shouting for assistance from the men outside. The brief struggle that followed was more chaos than combat. Jack managed to disable both guards, but not before one of them fired. A shot that brought the entire security detail running. Blackwood retreated up the stairs, screaming orders and threats in equal measure. "Marin, now!" Jack shouted, producing his lockpicks and attacking the shackles that bound her wrists. The mechanism was more complex than he had expected, requiring precious seconds that they no longer possessed. "Leave me," Marin said urgently. "Save yourself. They'll kill you if they catch you here." "Not happening," Jack replied grimly, his fingers working the lockpicks with desperate precision. "We go together or not at all." The shackles clicked open just as boots thundered down the cellar steps. Jack managed to get Marin to her feet and moving toward the stairs before the first of Silas's men appeared with rifles trained and ready. "Stop! Right there, Rowan." The confrontation lasted perhaps 30 seconds, long enough for Jack to realize that escape was impossible, short enough that no one was killed in the attempt. When Uncle Silas arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by urgent messenger from his railroad meeting, he found Jack Rowan bound and bloodied in his own cellar, Marin returned to her shackles, and Harrison Blackwood demanding immediate resolution to what he termed an unacceptable security breach. "This changes nothing," Silas declared, examining the scene with cold calculation. "If anything, it proves that more decisive measures are required." He turned to Blackwood with the expression of a businessman, acknowledging an unfortunate delay in delivery. "The wedding will proceed as scheduled, with or without the bride's cooperation." Marin met Jack's eyes across the cellar, seeing determination rather than defeat in his bloodied features. The failed rescue had cost them their freedom, but it had also confirmed something more valuable. Neither would abandon the other, regardless of the consequences. The torn wedding dress seemed to mock them from its corner, but its presence also reminded them that some things could be destroyed rather than surrendered. Sheriff Crawford arrived at the Clay Ranch before dawn, his badge catching the first pale light of morning as he surveyed the aftermath of Jack's failed rescue attempt. The star-shaped piece of metal had become more symbol than instrument of justice, a prop in Uncle Silas's carefully orchestrated performance of legal authority. Trespassing, breaking and entering, assault on lawful security personnel, Crawford recited with the mechanical precision of a man reading from a script. "That's 5 to 10 years in territorial prison, Rowan, assuming you live long enough to stand trial." Jack sat bound to a chair in the clay kitchen, his face bearing the marks of interrogation that had followed his capture. Blood had dried on. His split lip and his left eye was swollen nearly shut, but his spirit remained unbroken. He studied Crawford with the patient attention of a man cataloguing weaknesses for future reference. "Lawful security," Jack repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting description for hired thugs guarding an unlawfully imprisoned woman." Crawford's backhand carried the weight of frustrated authority and guilty conscience combined. "Miss Clay is where she belongs, under the protective custody of her legal guardian. Your opinion on family matters carries no legal weight whatsoever." Uncle Silas entered the kitchen, carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents and official seals. His silver hair was perfectly groomed despite the early hour, and his clothes showed no sign of the previous night's disturbance. He possessed the particular composure of a man who had transformed crisis into opportunity through careful planning and ruthless execution. "Sheriff," he said with cordial authority, "I believe Mr. Rowan's presence here demonstrates the need for more decisive action regarding my niece's situation. Clearly her current accommodations are insufficient to prevent outside interference." Crawford nodded, with the eager compliance of a subordinate seeking approval. "What do you have in mind, Mr. Clay?" Silas opened his portfolio and withdrew a document bearing the official seal of the territorial court. "A warrant for Mr. Rowan's arrest, naturally." but also a medical commitment order for my niece. Dr. Henley has examined her condition and determined that prolonged isolation has produced symptoms of mental instability that require professional treatment. Jack's blood ran cold as he understood the implications. Dr. Henley examined her through a locked door, if he examined her at all. Dr. Henley is a qualified physician whose professional judgment carries legal weight, Silas replied smoothly. His assessment indicates that Miss Clay's refusal to accept reasonable marriage arrangements stems from delusional thinking brought on by grief and isolation. Treatment at the territorial asylum will restore her capacity for rational decision-making. The asylum represented a fate worse than chains or cellar imprisonment. Once committed, Maren would disappear into a system designed to break spirits rather than heal minds. Patients who entered the territorial asylum rarely emerged unchanged, and many never emerged at all. "You bastard," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying deadly promise. "If you think locking her away in that hellhole will solve your problems, you've miscalculated badly." Silas smiled, with the cold satisfaction of a chess player executing a long-planned strategy. "On the contrary, Mr. Rowan, the asylum will provide exactly the environment necessary to restore my niece's mental equilibrium. With proper medical supervision and appropriate therapeutic intervention, she will undoubtedly recover her ability to make sound decisions about her future." Crawford stepped forward, with chains designed for prisoner transport, but his hands shook slightly as he prepared to secure them around Jack's wrists. "The circuit judge arrives next week. You'll have a fair trial, Rowan." "Fair trial?" Jack laughed bitterly. "Presided over by which judge, Crawford? The one who owes his appointment to railroad money, or the one who owes his re-election to Silas Clay's political support?" "Justice will be served according to law and proper procedure," Crawford replied, but his words carried no conviction. Uncle Silas closed his portfolio with the finality of a man concluding successful negotiations. "Mr. Rowan will have every opportunity to present his version of events to appropriate authorities. Unfortunately, the testimony of a known criminal carries limited weight against the sworn statements of respected citizens." As Crawford prepared to lead Jack away, Silas added a final refinement to his strategy. "Sheriff, I'm also placing a $500 bounty on information leading to the capture of any other individuals who might be planning to interfere with my family's private affairs. Gold has a way of clarifying people's loyalties and encouraging them to report suspicious activities." The bounty transformed Jack from isolated threat into community pariah. $500 represented more money than most local residents saw in 2 years of honest labor. Friends would become informants, neighbors would become watchers, and any hope of organized resistance would crumble under the weight of economic temptation. Jack met Silas's eyes with steady determination despite his circumstances. "You can buy cooperation and silence, but you can't buy legitimacy. What you're doing to Maren is wrong, and eventually people will remember the difference between legal and right." "Eventually," Silas agreed with infuriating calm, "is a very long time, Mr. Rowan, much longer than my niece can afford to wait." As Crawford led Jack away in chains, the morning sun rose over the Montana landscape, illuminating a world where justice had been purchased and freedom had become a commodity available only to those with sufficient gold to acquire it. The jail, cell in Cedar Falls, had been designed to hold drunks and petty thieves, not someone with Jack's knowledge of locks and security systems. But Sheriff Crawford had learned enough about his prisoner's reputation to ensure that escape would require outside assistance rather than technical skill alone. Jack spent his first day of imprisonment mapping the building's layout and studying the rhythms of his captors. Crawford maintained a skeleton staff, one deputy during day hours, the sheriff himself during evening rounds, and no one at all during the small hours before dawn. The arrangement suggested either confidence in the cell's security or dangerous complacency about prisoner supervision. On his second night, Jack heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching the jail through the alley behind the building. The movement was too careful to be casual, too purposeful to be accidental. Someone was approaching with stealth and specific intent. A small object struck the barred window of his cell, a pebble thrown with enough force to get attention without making excessive noise. Jack moved to the window and peered out into darkness that gradually resolved into the outline of a familiar figure. Mr. Rowan. The voice belonged to Sarah Whitman, but her presence in the alley behind the jail suggested desperation rather than social courtesy. "Mrs. Whitman," Jack replied quietly, "this is dangerous for you. If Crawford finds you here—" "Sheriff Crawford is passed out drunk in Murphy's saloon," Sarah interrupted. "He's been drinking heavily since your arrest, and I suspect his conscience is troubling him more than he expected." She approached the window and withdrew something from beneath her shawl, a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of metal against metal. "Lock picks," she explained. "I found them in your saddlebags before the sheriff could inventory your possessions. Thought you might have use for them." Jack accepted the tools with gratitude and growing curiosity. "Mrs. Whitman, helping a prisoner. Escape is a serious crime. What's changed your situation enough to risk such action?" Sarah's voice carried the weight of moral certainty that had sustained her through weeks of complicity with Uncle Silas's tyranny. "Dr. Henley examined Miss Marin this afternoon. The examination was thorough. She fought, Mr. Rowan. She fought with everything she had, but they held her down and declared her mentally incompetent based on her refusal to cooperate with their handling." The implications struck Jack like physical blows. Medical examinations conducted against a patient's will often involved procedures that had nothing to do with mental health assessment and everything to do with establishing control. Through humiliation and violation. Where is she now? Still in the cellar, but not for long. The asylum wagon arrives tomorrow morning to transport her to the territorial facility. Once she's committed, Mr. Silas can have her declared legally incompetent and make all decisions. Regarding her property and marriage arrangements, Jack's hands clenched around the lockpicks until the metal edges drew blood from his palms. And Harrison Blackwood, growing impatient with delays, he's threatened to withdraw his investment in Mr. Silas's railroad partnership unless the marriage proceeds immediately. Whether Miss Marin is present and conscious for the ceremony seems to be negotiable. The revelation transformed Jack's understanding of the timeline they faced. Marin's commitment to the asylum wasn't just imprisonment, it was preparation for a wedding that would proceed with or without her meaningful participation. "Mrs. Whitman," Jack said carefully, "escape from this jail will make me a fugitive. I'll be hunted by every lawman in the territory, and anyone who helps me will face serious consequences. Are you prepared for that reality?" Sarah straightened, her shoulders with visible resolve. "Mr. Rowan, I've spent 8 years watching good people suffer while evil men prospered because decent folks were too frightened to act. Miss Marin's situation has shown me the cost of silence and the price of choosing safety over justice." She reached into her shawl again and produced a small leather bag that rustled with the distinctive sound of dried herbs and roots. "This comes from Morning Star, a Blackfoot woman who trades medicine and wisdom in the settlements north of here. She says it will help if Miss Marin has been given laudanum or other substances to make her compliant." The medicine pouch represented more than herbal remedies. It symbolized the network of women who had watched Marin's situation with growing outrage and mounting determination to act. Morning Star's involvement suggested that opposition to Uncle Silas extended beyond the immediate community into alliances that Crawford and his corrupt colleagues had never considered. "Morning Star also provided this," Sarah continued, withdrawing a detailed map drawn on soft deerskin. "It shows paths through the northern hills that avoid main roads and settlements, routes that men like Sheriff Crawford wouldn't know existed." Jack studied the map by moonlight, recognizing the careful attention to detail that marked it as the work of someone who understood the landscape intimately. Every water source, every defensible position, every potential hiding place had been marked, with symbols that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge. The asylum wagon arrived with the grim efficiency of an undertaker's carriage, its black-painted sides bearing no identification except the territorial seal that legitimized its terrible purpose. 2 attendants sat on the driver's bench, large, men with the patient demeanor of those accustomed to handling unwilling passengers. Behind them, the wagon's interior had been fitted with restraints designed to prevent both escape and self-harm during transport. Uncle Silas emerged from the ranch house carrying a leather portfolio thick with official documents. His silver hair caught the morning light as he moved with the measured confidence of a man whose plans were proceeding exactly as designed. The commitment papers bore Dr. Henley's signature, Sheriff Crawford's official seal, and the judge's authorization. A trifecta of corrupted authority that would transform Maren from free woman to institutional patient with the stroke of administrative pens. Gentlemen, Silas addressed the asylum attendants with cordial authority. I trust the journey from the territorial facility was without incident. No problems, Mr. Clay, the senior attendant replied. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, with the kind of physical presence that suggested experience in subduing resistant patients. We brought extra restraints as requested. Sometimes the laudanum isn't sufficient for patients who've developed resistance to medication. In the cellar below, Maren fought against the drug-induced lethargy that clouded her thoughts and weakened her limbs. Dr. Henley's examination had included forced administration of laudanum, ostensibly to calm her hysteria, but actually to ensure compliance during transport. The substance made thinking difficult and movement sluggish, but it couldn't completely suppress the rage that burned in her chest like banked coals, waiting for oxygen. Sarah descended the cellar steps, carrying what appeared to be Maren's final meal, but was actually Morningstar's herbal remedy disguised as ordinary tea. The mixture contained willow bark for clarity, ginseng for strength, and other plants whose properties would counteract the laudanum's effects if given time to work. Miss Maren, Sarah whispered urgently, drink this quickly, all of it. Mr. Rowan is coming, but you need to be able to move when the time comes. Maren forced herself to consume the bitter liquid, despite her body's rebellion against any additional substance. Trust in Sarah's loyalty and desperate hope for rescue overcame the caution that might otherwise have prevented her from accepting unknown medicine. Above them, Uncle Silas conducted his business with the casual brutality of a man selling livestock. The patient has become increasingly violent and delusional since her parents' death, refuses to accept reasonable arrangements for her care and maintenance. Yesterday she attacked Dr. Henley during his examination, requiring physical restraint. To complete his assessment, the lies flowed with practiced ease, each fabrication building upon previous deceptions to create a narrative that justified whatever treatment the asylum chose to provide. Maren Clay would disappear into the territorial facility as a dangerous lunatic, and any future complaints or appeals would be dismissed as symptoms of her diagnosed condition. Standard procedure in cases of violent resistance. The attendant confirmed, checking his pocket watch with professional detachment. Transport restraints first, then institutional evaluation upon arrival. Usually takes 6 to 8 weeks to establish proper medication protocols for patients with her type of delusions. 6 to 8 weeks would be more than sufficient for Uncle Silas's purposes. By the time Maren's mind cleared enough to mount any coherent resistance, she would be Harrison Blackwood's wife-in-law, if not in fact, and her property would be permanently beyond her reach. The first explosion came without warning, a thunderous roar from the direction of the barn that sent birds erupting from nearby trees and horses screaming in their corrals. The blast shattered windows throughout the ranch house and created a mushroom of smoke and debris. that suggested catastrophic destruction. What the hell? Uncle Silas spun toward the sound, his composure cracking for the first time since Maren's imprisonment began. The second explosion followed immediately, this time from the equipment shed where Uncle Silas stored his most valuable ranch machinery. The carefully placed charges created maximum noise and visible damage while avoiding any real threat to human life. "We're under attack!" one of the guards shouted, running toward the house with his rifle raised. "Someone's trying to destroy the whole place." Uncle Silas's reaction was swift and predictable. "Secure the perimeter. Find out who's responsible. Kill anyone who doesn't belong here." The asylum attendants looked to their employer for direction, uncertain whether their contract included participation in armed conflict. "Mr. Clay, perhaps we should postpone the patient transfer until this situation is resolved." "No postponement," Silas snapped, his careful planning disintegrating under the pressure of unexpected assault. "Get her loaded and get her out of here. Now, before whoever's doing this decides to target the house directly." In the confusion that followed, as guards ran toward the sources of explosions and Uncle Silas shouted contradictory orders, Jack Rowan moved through the chaos with the focused precision of a man whose entire plan depended on the next few minutes. The cellar door stood momentarily unguarded as every available man rushed to defend against threats that existed everywhere except where they were looking. Morning Star's medicine was beginning to clear Maren's mind, and Sarah stood ready, with keys liberated from Uncle Silas's distracted security chief. But Uncle Silas himself remained near the asylum wagon, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip and his eyes scanning the approaches to the house with the alertness of a man who had survived frontier politics by anticipating treachery from every direction. The breaking point had arrived, and everything would be decided by courage, timing, and the willingness to risk everything for freedom. Jack moved through the smoke and confusion with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to thrive in chaos. The explosions had achieved their intended effect. Uncle Silas's security team was scattered across the property, chasing threats that existed only as noise and destruction, while the real danger approached from an entirely different direction. The cellar door stood unguarded for perhaps 90 seconds, a window of opportunity that would either secure Maren's freedom or doom them both to worse fates than they currently faced. Jack descended the wooden steps with his lockpicks already in hand, ready to attack whatever restraints he found. But Sarah had anticipated his needs. The keys she had liberated from the distracted security chief turned the shackle locks with satisfying clicks, and Maren's wrists came free for the first time in weeks. The iron restraints fell to the cellar floor with sounds that seemed to echo with all the weight of her captivity. "Can you walk?" Jack asked urgently, supporting Maren, as she struggled to stand on legs, weakened by confinement and drugs. "I can do whatever freedom requires," she replied, her voice stronger than her physical condition suggested. Morning Star's medicine was clearing the laudanum from her system, but recovery would take time they didn't possess. The bolt cutters Jack produced from his pack made quick work of the chain that had tethered Maren to the cellar wall. The tool felt heavy in his hands, weighty with symbolism as well as iron. Each link that parted under its jaws represented another barrier between Maren and the life that was rightfully hers. "Sarah," Jack said as they prepared to leave the cellar, "ride north to Morning Star's cabin. Stay there until this is finished, regardless of how long that takes." Sarah shook her head with quiet determination. "I'm not abandoning Miss Maren. Now, Mr. Rowan, we'll all leave together or not at all." The sound of approaching footsteps on the kitchen floor above ended their debate. Uncle Silas had apparently realized that the explosions were diversions rather than genuine attacks, and his attention had returned to securing his most valuable asset. "Maren!" Silas's voice carried through the cellar ceiling with fury and desperation. Combined, I know you're still down there, and I know someone's helping you." Jack positioned himself at the bottom of the cellar steps, his broken revolver drawn despite its useless condition. The weapon might not fire, but Uncle Silas wouldn't know that until he attempted to test its functionality. "Mr. Clay," Jack called up the stairs, "I think it's time we had a conversation about your business practices and their legal implications." "Jack Rowan," Silas replied with cold satisfaction. "I should have known. Always the romantic fool, riding to rescue damsels in distress. Unfortunately for you, this particular damsel belongs to me now." "Property ownership," Jack said conversationally, helping Marin toward the cellar window while keeping his weapon trained on the stairs, "requires legitimate acquisition. Forgery and fraud don't generally hold up in honest courts." "Honest courts," Silas laughed bitterly. "You still don't understand how the world actually works, do you, Rowan? Honest courts exist only for people who can't afford to purchase more convenient alternatives." The conversation served multiple purposes. It kept Uncle Silas talking instead of shooting, provided Marin time to reach the window, and allowed Jack to gauge his opponent's mental state and likely actions. Silas was angry but not panicked, calculating but not desperate enough to take truly reckless action. Marin reached the cellar window and began working the latch with fingers that were steadier than they had been minutes earlier. The opening was small, but her weeks of confinement had left her thin enough to squeeze through if necessary. Freedom lay just beyond that rectangle of glass and morning light. "Miss Clay," Silas called down the stairs, "you have 30 seconds to return to your proper place before I demonstrate the consequences of continued defiance. Mr. Rowan's romantic gestures won't protect you from the realities of territorial law and my connections within it." "Uncle," Marin replied with quiet dignity, "the only thing you've demonstrated is the difference between legal authority and moral legitimacy. My father would be ashamed to see what you've become." The mention of Thomas Clay struck Uncle Silas like a physical blow. "Your father was weak. He built dreams instead of power, chose sentiment over success. I'm offering you everything he could never provide: security, status, a future that extends beyond this godforsaken frontier." "You're offering me bondage disguised as privilege," Marin said, echoing words she had spoken weeks earlier. "The same choice you've been demanding since the day my parents died." Jack heard movement above, multiple sets of footsteps converging on the kitchen as Uncle Silas's scattered security team regrouped around the house. The window of opportunity was closing rapidly, and the next few minutes would determine whether their escape succeeded or ended in capture and worse consequences than they had faced before. "Marin," he said quietly, "it's time to go." She nodded and began climbing through the cellar window, her movements growing stronger as Morning Star's medicine continued its work. The morning sunlight that touched her face seemed to restore color and vitality that weeks of darkness had drained away. Freedom was only steps away, but Uncle Silas and his men stood between them and the horses that would carry them to safety. The chase that followed Marin's escape from the cellar window lasted 3 days and covered nearly 100 miles of Montana wilderness. Jack's knowledge of terrain and Morning Star's carefully marked routes kept them ahead of Uncle Silas's pursuit, but barely. The corrupt sheriff had assembled a posse that included federal marshals, railroad security, and hired gunmen whose loyalties extended only as far as the gold that purchased their services. On the morning of the 4th day, exhausted and running, low on supplies, Jack and Marin crested a ridge that revealed the town of Billings spread below them like a promise of civilization. More importantly, it revealed the presence of Judge Marcus Henley, not the corrupt Dr. Henley who had declared Marin mentally incompetent, but his honest brother who rode the territorial circuit and had built a reputation for dispensing justice without regard for wealth or political connections. "Judge Henley," Jack explained as they prepared for what might be their final gamble, "is the one honest jurist in this part of the territory. If we can reach him with evidence of what your uncle has done, we might have a chance at real justice." rather than purchased verdicts. The evidence they carried was substantial. Sarah had managed to secure Uncle Silas's private correspondence before fleeing the ranch, including letters that detailed his forgery of land deeds, his bribery of local officials, and his plans to have Maren committed regardless of her actual mental state. Most damaging was his own confession letter, a document he had written to Harrison Blackwood, explaining exactly how he intended to circumvent Maren's legal rights and secure her compliance through institutional abuse. The court documents that would restore Maren's inheritance lay within that correspondence, along with proof of Uncle Silas's systematic corruption of the legal process. Judge Henley's reputation suggested he would act on such evidence, but only if they could present it before Uncle Silas's influence reached him first. They entered Billings separately, with Maren disguised as a traveling widow and Jack maintaining the appearance of a drifter seeking work. The ruse lasted exactly long enough for them to reach the courthouse, where Judge Henley was conducting morning sessions on a variety of territorial matters. Uncle Silas arrived 20 minutes later with Sheriff Crawford and a complement of federal marshals. But by then, it was too late to prevent Maren from presenting her case to honest authority. Judge Henley was a man of perhaps 60 years, with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed capable of seeing through deception regardless of its sophistication. He examined Uncle Silas's forged documents with the careful attention of someone who understood both law and human nature, comparing signatures and seals with the methodical precision of a scholar. "Mr. Clay," the judge said after reviewing the evidence, "these documents raise serious questions about the legitimacy of your guardianship and the methods you've employed to exercise authority over your niece." Uncle Silas maintained his composure, with visible effort, but his silver hair was disheveled from the hard ride, and his usual immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. "Your Honor, my niece has been under medical care for mental instability. Any documents she's presented were likely forged by the criminal who abducted her from lawful custody. The criminal in question," Judge Henley observed mildly, "appears to be Mr. Jack Rowan, who stands accused of rescuing a woman from unlawful imprisonment. The documents in question include your own correspondence, written in your hand and bearing your personal seal." The confession letter proved devastating to Uncle Silas's carefully constructed narrative. His own words describe Maren as perfectly rational but inconveniently independent, detailed his plans to use the asylum as temporary housing while marriage arrangements are finalized, and explained how Dr. Henley's false diagnosis would provide legal cover for whatever persuasion proves necessary. Furthermore, Judge Henley continued, "the land deeds you've presented show clear signs of alteration. Signature analysis suggests forgery, and the dates don't align with probate records from your brother's estate." Sheriff Crawford stepped forward with the nervous energy of a man watching his world collapse. "Judge, with respect, these are serious accusations against a respected member of the community. Perhaps private discussion would be more appropriate than public proceedings." "Sheriff Crawford," the judge replied with cold authority, "your suggestion that justice should be conducted in private is precisely the kind of thinking that created this situation. Public wrongs require public remedies." The courtroom had filled during the proceedings as word spread through Billings that a dramatic case was unfolding. Citizens who had heard rumors about Maren's disappearance now witnessed the truth behind Uncle Silas's carefully maintained facade. Harrison Blackwood, who had arrived with the pursuit party, attempted to salvage his investment through direct appeal to the judge. "Your Honor, regardless of irregularities in documentation, Miss Clay and I have a binding agreement for marriage. Business considerations require—" "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Henley interrupted sharply, "marriage contracts require the free consent of both parties. Miss Clay's testimony suggests that her consent was neither freely given nor legitimately obtained. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Uncle Silas's guardianship was terminated immediately. All property transfers were declared null and void, and Maren's full legal rights were restored. More importantly, Judge Henley ordered a territorial investigation into corruption within the local sheriff's department and issued warrants for Uncle Silas's arrest on charges of fraud, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. Miss Clay, the judge, said as the proceedings concluded, "Your property will be restored to your control, and you will receive territorial protection while these criminal matters are resolved. The law has failed you, but justice, though delayed, will not be denied." As Uncle Silas was led away in chains, the same iron restraints that had once bound Maren's wrists, the symmetry of justice felt both satisfying and sobering. Power built on corruption could be dismantled by truth, but only when honest authority had the courage to act regardless of consequences. 6 months after Judge Henley's ruling, the Montana highlands bloomed with the promise of spring and the deeper promise of lives rebuilt on foundations of choice rather than coercion. The Clay Ranch had been restored to its rightful owner, but more importantly, it had been transformed from a place of imprisonment into a sanctuary of freedom and new possibilities. 1 year after the chains were broken, Maren Rowan stood beneath the old oak tree that marked the boundary between what had been 2 separate properties and was now one shared dream. The marriage had taken place in spring, witnessed by a community that had learned to celebrate freedom rather than merely tolerate its absence. The new land deed bore both their names in careful script, documenting not just legal ownership, but the merger of 2 lives that had found their way back to each other. Across years of separation and struggle, the document represented more than property rights. It was evidence of a partnership built on equality and sustained by mutual respect. Jack approached through the tall grass, carrying their infant son with the careful attention of a man who understood that some treasures required gentle handling. The baby had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and bore the name Thomas Freedom Rowan, honoring the grandfather he would never meet and the principle his parents had fought to preserve. Morning Star brought news from the territorial capital, Jack said, settling beside his wife beneath the tree where they had first shared childhood sorrows and discovered the healing power of friendship. The Railroad Consortium has agreed to the new regulations. No more forced land acquisitions, no more bribing of local officials. The victory was larger than their personal story, though their story had helped make it possible. The corruption that Uncle Silas had represented was being systematically dismantled throughout the territory, replaced by institutions that remembered their obligation to serve justice rather than power. Sarah's letter came yesterday, Maren said, adjusting the baby's blanket with movements that had become second nature in the months since motherhood had added new dimensions to her understanding of protection and love. She's been appointed to the Territorial Women's Advocacy Commission, first woman to hold such a position. The changes spreading through Montana reflected a broader recognition that freedom belonged to everyone, regardless of gender, background, or economic status. Laws were being rewritten, officials were being held accountable, and communities were learning to distinguish between order that served justice and order that served privilege. Do you think he'll ask about his grandfather someday? Jack wondered, watching their son's face with the fascination that parenthood brings to ordinary moments. He'll ask about everything, Maren replied with quiet certainty. About the grandfather who built with love, about the uncle who chose greed over family, about the father who risked everything for justice. We'll tell him the truth, that freedom isn't inherited but earned, that love isn't demanded but given, and that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. The wooden horses, Freedom and Hope, sat on the mantelpiece. In their home now, watched over by 2 children who would grow up understanding that some things were worth fighting for. The carved toys served as daily reminders that the past had shaped them but didn't define them, that tomorrow belonged to those willing to work for it. As the sun set over the Montana highlands, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise, Jack and Maren reflected on the journey that had brought them from childhood friendship through adult trials to this moment of hard-won peace. The chains that had once bound body and spirit were gone, replaced by bonds freely chosen and joyfully maintained. "Thank you," Maren said quietly, her hand finding Jack's with the naturalness of long practice. "For what?" "For remembering that a wooden horse was named Freedom. For believing that promises made by children matter to the adults they become. For proving that some things are worth any price to preserve." In the distance, the lights of their neighbors' homes twinkled like stars brought down to earth, each one representing a family learning to build their own version of freedom and hope. The valley that had once been ruled by fear and corruption now bloomed with the possibility that justice and love could triumph over power and greed, one choice at a time.